So in the last video, we went through the drum design of one of the recent songs that I've been creating. And I thought it'd be quite good to turn this into a series and potentially look at some of the other elements. Today, what we're going to be going through is the bass design, also the mid bass design, all of which came from a single sample from Serum. If you find today's video useful, please do like, comment, and subscribe. Any suggestions that you have, please do leave them in the comments, and I hope you find today's video useful. So just as a reminder for what this song sounds like, I'll play it from here.
We sing loud and we stand tall.
So let's have a look at some of the bass lines today. Now, the bass lines are they're quite simple, but the way that they evolve is kind of in keeping with minimal drum and bass, because it's sort of small changes and nothing too drastic, but you know that something is going on. So if we just solo the bass group so you can hear what it sounds like. So to begin with, this patch it's quite simple to make. So it's just two sine waves, oscillator A taking FM from B, and then this is being controlled by an LFO. So if we were to go ahead and listen to that. So one tip that I learned from a dubstep production video years and years ago for sound design like this is to use one LFO or envelope to control multiple parameters, because what that does is it just allows the sound to be a lot more cohesive, and yeah, just a lot more joined together. So with that in mind, I've got LFO3 controlling the FM from B, the cutoff, and also the distortion. So they're all growing and rising at the same time. So it just means that the sound is nice and cohesive. Now, in terms of this sound design itself, where it starts to get interesting is the slight variations that are taking place on basses 2 and also bass 3 as well. So what I mean by that is if we were to open this patch, which is bass 2, we can see here that first of all, we've increased the unison, and we've also increased the amount of drive that's going on in the distortion. So when we listen to that, it's got more harmonics on the upper end of the spectrum. So let's show that on a spectrum. So with bass 1, you can see in this sort of lower to mid range, there's not going to be as much activity as there is in bass 2. So you can see here there's a lot more going on. Now, the reason I did that is because I don't want to drastically change the bass too much, but I did want it to have some subtle differences. When we listen to those together, and then in context, so it's just slightly different. Now, bass 3 again, very similar idea. It's got just a touch more unison and a touch more drive, and maybe even a little bit more on the cutoff. So it's very, very simple stuff, just in terms of some of the processing that's going on. Obviously put it into mono, cut out some of those sort of higher frequencies there, just because we've got some other elements with the mid bass group that we want to accentuate. and then I've sidechained both the snares and the kicks, and then sort of added a bit of processing with sort of saturation, erosion when necessary. So that's it for the sub bass, and then we've also got this mid growl bass group here, and this is where things are honestly a lot more interesting. So if we listen to the bass groups together, you can then begin to see how they're sort of interchanging with one another. So let's start with just the bass group on its own. So first of all, the way that I've created all of these sounds is by recording out of this bass group. And that's typically how I like to create these mid-bass frequencies, because it's matching the lowest elements in our song, and they just join together really nicely. So the way that I do that is by taking a frozen recording from the sub bass, so this. And what I'll do is I'll create a new audio track, record this in from bass audio 1, and then I'll start adding in some effects to this. Typically, I'd probably put on some quite big reverb, because then it gives you some nice tails that you can begin to manipulate later. Maybe even some auto pan just to give it a bit of movement. Put that maybe on like on a third. And then I'll probably cut out all of the low ends to begin with, maybe at like sort of 200 hertz. So you can already begin to hear that this is starting to sound like some of those mid-bass elements. So what I'll do is, when I've created a number of different chains to then record from, is I'll just start playing around with as many effects as I can. A kind of a classic go-to to get some quick and nice sounding variation is to use effects like thermal. If you don't have that, you can absolutely use some of the audio effects racks, which sound really good. Some of their distortion effects sound really nice. Of course, if they're a little bit too harsh, you can just process them further later. Now, what we'll do is, once we've created them, this is when we're then going to start to apply some more automation. So if I open this a bit more, so this is what it sounds like with no effects. It sounds pretty horrible. But then when we start adding these back in, they're starting to sound a little bit nicer. So first of all, cutting out some of these really harsh sort of mid frequencies, adding in some reverb just to the high end, and as you can see, it's got a really long reverb, and I'll get onto that in a minute, and then some echo. And this is something that I've started to do quite frequently, actually, with my sound design. So let's make that a bit smaller, get rid of this guy. The reason that I've been adding echo is, if we look at the automation of this, we can see here that when we get to the second beat, it's given us some really, really nice movement from the echo. Then when we look at the echo itself, you can see here that they line up. So this is a kind of quite a nice swell effect. So if you just listen to that on its own, you can hear that it's sucking the sound in sort of quite a minimal way, and not very invasive. When we then add the echo back in there, it just gives it a bit more movement. And you can create a very similar effect using AutoPan. Now, I've done this kind of across probably most, actually, of the mid-frequency sound design. So you can hear this has probably got a thermal plugin, Funk Hunter. Maybe not. So with this particular sound, you can see here that the reverb automation is a lot more sort of complex than the automation above. So that's kind of creating its own movement. And when you then combine that in with the bass line, it's just kind of going between those like rises and peaks. So in context, if we try and listen out for that,
We sing loud and we stand tall.
it's just adding like a really small amount of movement that, unless you're listening out for it, you're probably not going to hear, but it just plays into the idea of minimal drum and bass being quite lots of small things are happening that sort of build up to a much bigger picture. And then finally, this layer on the top is just kind of, it's just got some noise added to it and some reverb. So it's basically just enhancing the sub bass line. And just sort of stretching those sounds out a little bit. And then we've just got some variation in sort of the frequency of these growls as well. Now, I did touch upon this in a different video, but this is one of my favorite sounds to use to sort of transition between different songs, which is this. I'll leave a link to how to create that sound in the description below. This is just a really nice sound to use because it's got a very unique presence about it. And it's also not adhering to sort of the structure of the song. It's sort of doing its own thing. The way that we achieve that, again, automating the reverb and then using some auto pan. And then in the wider context of the song, and I use it again here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for the actual automation and the sound design and so on. Just in terms of some of the effects that I've used, because these have been processed and then re-recorded and processed so many times, this is kind of looking a little bit minimal. I automated the gain on this first drop just because it sounded a bit quiet. So if we were to look at that, you can see here, it's just going from, it's just being increased by 2.8, just to kind of create the anticipation for the drop a little bit more. And other than that, a glue compressor just to kind of join these sounds together, so they're sitting a little bit nicer in the mix. And then in the bass group, as I mentioned, just some pretty standard compression and sort of final cuts of some of the undesirable frequencies. So I'm just having a look. Is there anything else? What's this guy doing? Yeah, so this is something else that we can have a quick look into. So this is the sort of second half of the first drop that then takes us into the breakdown. So just to keep that continuity going, you can see here that again we've automated the reverb. I actually did that because without it, just because of the way that it recorded, it had too much of a pumper effect that I didn't like. So I just used this to kind of glue those together. We've got an auto pan going at, what's that, 4 bars maybe? Oh, I don't know, but it's slow. And then we've also got a saturated just to kind of get some of those frequencies sounding a bit nicer. And that pretty much concludes it for the bass sound design. I think kind of the two takeaway points from this is, first of all, once I'd created the bass, so once I created the sub bass, this is where all of the other mid bass elements came from. So they're all just recordings with effects applied and then re-recorded with different effects applied to get some of these sounds. So even these two sounds would have came from the same place. And it's just the effects that you apply. And then second is, this really is just all trial and error. Half the effects that I use in the audio effects rack, I just kind of chuck them on, play around with a couple of the parameters and just see what sounds good. knowing that even if I don't like it, I can still just re-record it and eventually get to something that I do like. So just kind of keep going. It is just trial and error, and eventually it will start sounding good. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, please do leave them in the comment section. I'll certainly reply. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you found today's lesson particularly useful. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.